Good evening, everyone. I'm Crystal Collins-Judd, the president of Sarah Lawrence, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening. This does seem a timely moment for this particular reading. As you know, at this time tomorrow night, states across the country will be tallying Super Tuesday results, thinking about what our vision is, our collective vision for the upcoming presidential election. As you know, as most of you know, Sarah Lawrence this year has been exploring the theme E pluribus unum. What does it mean for us to ask hard questions, think about ideas, motivations behind current events, and this election, out of many one? What does that mean for us in this country? What does it mean for us as a college and as a community? And so as we were exploring that theme, it seemed particularly appropriate, and I want to thank Melissa Frazier for helping organize tonight's event, because it seemed particularly appropriate to bring MFA writing faculty member Cliff Thompson to talk to us about his newest book, What It Is, Race, Family, and One Thinking Black Man's Blues, an exploration of the diversity of this country. In writing it, Cliff talks about having left that which is familiar and meeting with individuals across the country that he otherwise would have had little reason to engage with, looking for understanding and trying to find his own answers. And so we are delighted that Cliff is sharing time with us tonight. Cliff is going to begin with a reading from the book, and then Kanwal Singh, our provost, will join him in a discussion after the reading and then open that out into the audience. So thank you all for being here tonight, and welcome, Cliff.
Thank you so much. Is this good? Okay, I'm very glad to be here. So I'm just going to read two, possibly three selections from the book. I think I'll just dive right in, beginning with part of the introduction, and I think that gives a pretty good idea of what the book is like, and I'll kind of fill things in between. So. This is from the introduction. I am a black man, Brooklyn-based, 54 years old as I write this. For nearly as long as I can remember, there has been, at the core of my being, making me who I am, or who I feel that I am, the belief that I must treat everyone as an individual, that I must not base my judgments on anything as inconsequential as skin color. And for most of my adult life, I have chosen to see myself as an American, because of the contributions black people have made to this country, because of how inextricably this country is tied to my heritage, and despite white racist beliefs that this country is theirs more than it is mine. Living according to these principles has sometimes been tough. In my late teens and 20s, moving from the all-black environment where I grew up to integrated circles in college and beyond, I sometimes felt like the only black person I knew who was not reluctant, because of distrust, dislike, or both, to be in the predominantly white settings where my interests often took me. I clung stubbornly to my beliefs, and in my mid-20s I found what I considered to be support for my point of view when I picked up, somewhat belatedly, the books of James Baldwin. Leaving aside for a moment the music of Baldwin's sentences, the grandness of his vision, the wisdom and lyricism he brings to expressing the anger and ache of being black in America, he was the first model I found of one who brought everything he had to bear on opposing racism without being racist himself. His fiction, particularly the underappreciated Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone, and his nonfiction, none more eloquent than The Fire Next Time, are the work of a man who rages at injustice but loves deeply and without regard to pigmentation. While the assassinations of Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King Jr., along with other aspects of the backlash against the civil rights movement, left Baldwin embittered and disillusioned, they did not ultimately compromise his humanity or make him into a racist. He remained, for me, a model of how to conduct oneself with regard to race. And yet, I still felt some confusion. There was one substantive difference between me and the white people in my circle. Being white, I discovered, seemed to make one exempt from the question of who one is. They were Americans, these white people, and it never seemed to occur to them, and certainly no one ever indicated to them that they should think otherwise. Many black people, of course, are exempt from this question of who they are, too, by virtue of living and working largely or wholly among other blacks. But if a person's life and interests take him, as mine have taken me, to places where he looks different from most others, that person may begin to ask where the similarities between himself and these others end, and the differences beyond the obvious one begin. What the basis for these similarities is, and what the basis for the differences is, and into which camp, similarity or difference, nationality falls. And with regard to the very question of whether nationality constitutes a bond or barrier between oneself and others, the basis of this question is an unspoken assumption that runs so deep, that is reinforced so often and in so many ways, that I passed 3 decades of life on Earth before I questioned it. The assumption that being American means being white. At best, the place of blacks in all this seemed to be the one described by the comedian Chris Rock, who said that for us, America is like the uncle who molested you and then paid for your college education. As much as I would like to say that I began to question that assumption on my own, I had help. It was the work of the essayist Stanley Crouch, which in turn led me to the work of his mentor and soon to be mine, Albert Murray, that opened my eyes. Murray's books, beginning with the Omni-Americans, posed an alternate view, that America, rather than simply being a white monster that feeds on people of color and that only the most self-hating of dark-skinned folks would identify with, is in fact largely a black creation, in terms of everything from culture to physical labor, and that the blood, sweat, and investment of generations of blacks makes America our home as much as it is anyone's. According to this view, the struggles blacks have historically faced have provided the obstacles over which we demonstrated the ability to triumph. As Murray wrote in The Omni-Americans, quote, "The legendary exploits of white U.S. backwoodsmen, keel boatmen, and prairie schoonermen become relatively safe when one sets them beside the breathtaking escapes of the fugitive slave beating his way south to Florida, west to the Indians, and north to faraway Canada, through swamp and town alike, seeking freedom. Nobody was chasing Daniel Boone," unquote. To say I am an American, then, is not an act of capitulation, but the first step toward claiming one's birthright, recognizing the setting of one's ancestors' triumphs and adventures. It is tantamount to saying, I am home. The symbol for this idea, the art form that allows me to celebrate this notion of laying claim to a home, birthright, and identity, is jazz. The basis of jazz, a black contribution to American and world culture, is improvisation, a metaphor for the story of black Americans who have historically had to make a way where none existed before, a way that brought about both the Underground Railroad and the Civil Rights Movement. Every time a jazz musician improvises a passage, he or she celebrates this history. I embrace the sound and what it stood for, the fleet-footed sweetness of the alto saxophonist Julian Cannonball Adderley, the crusty vulnerability of Ben Webster's tenor sax, the spare melancholy of Miles Davis's trumpet, the sheer might of the original tenor man Coleman Hawkins, the beautiful eccentricity of Thelonious Monk's piano, the deceptive laziness of Billie Holiday's voice, the doggedness and inventiveness of the young Freddie Hubbard as he played trumpet lines over and through the thundering drum beats of Art Blakey, the doggedness and inventiveness necessary for survival for any jazz musician, any black person, anyone at all. And so, in my early 30s, a youngish man and new father to a biracial child, a budding essayist who earned his living as an editor and copy editor, a seeker after cultural knowledge with Murray in my head and Baldwin in my heart, I set out into the big bad world, reading book after book while strap hanging on my way to and from work, listening at night to those jazz records that were the record of my people's contribution, believing all the while in the rightness of calling myself an American as years and then 2 decades passed. Along the way, the first black president was elected, which appeared to confirm what I had already decided. Along the way, events may have chipped at the outside of my beliefs. Killings of blacks, from Trayvon Martin on through Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, and so many others, may have led me to question whether I really wanted to call home a place where the police were seemingly paid to kill people who looked like me. And yet, neither Baldwin nor Murray had ever said that I wouldn't have to fight to protect my place in this land I called home. With many others, I took to the streets over those killings and believed I was doing so in service of my country. Perhaps some, black and white, wondered how I could be so even-keeled, and perhaps some, white as well as black, wanted me to be angrier. Some whites in particular appeared to think I should act through my anger as their conscience. The problem was that I already had a job. I did not have time to be anyone's conscience. And there is a word for one who does others' work for no pay, and I'm not thinking of intern. And so my beliefs at bottom held steady. And then came the election of Donald Trump. For a black man who has based his life on a belief in treating everyone as an individual and on an identification with America, what is the right response to a successful presidential campaign that brought out xenophobia like lava from a volcano? How do I respond to the fact that the majority of white voters, whom I have refused to hate as a group, supported this man? Should I hold on even tighter to the notion of being an American and fight to protect myself and my country from this menace? Or should I distance myself from a country where so many people seem to have demonstrated that they care nothing about me? Is it time to resign my post as the only non-racist black person in America? Or is now, when my principles are sorely tested, the most crucial time to hold on to them? I had arrived at my beliefs with the help of Baldwin and Murray, but I began to sense during this crisis that I needed still another writer, not to give me answers, but to serve as a model for how I might find them on my own. Okay, so there, the writer I refer to there is Joan Didion. I go on to say in the introduction that what I admire about Didion is the way that she is able to look at things and see them and discuss them not according to received wisdom or what's already in her own mind, but seeing them for what they are and talking about them and seeing them clearly. And it's an approach that I hope to bring to the book, in which I try to sort of make sense of things myself by traveling to different parts of the country, talking to a small group, a small but disparate group of people, and conducting in-depth interviews. So I thought I would read. So the book is in 5 chapters. The first 2 sort of trace the sort of my life and the history and development of my thinking up to the election of Donald Trump. The 3rd and 4th chapters comprise the interviews, and the 5th chapter kind of sums everything up. And so I thought I would read from just an excerpt from one of the interviews. So it's conducted with a man I call Bob in the book. Bob lives in California. He's in his 70s. He's a retired California highway patrolman. So I think that's all you need to know. So this is Bob talking. My first encounter with black people was on the highway patrol at the academy. Instructors, Bob told me. That's interesting, I said. I had a sergeant who was a black person that I really, really liked. And I don't have anything against any color of skin. I don't care what color you are. You are who you are. And I like you for who you are, not what color your skin is. I treated everybody on the road the same way. I should say that Bob is a Trump voter. The reason why you stopped me is because I'm driving a red Corvette. The fact that you're going 80 miles an hour in a 65 zone have anything to do with that? You stopped me because I'm black. No, I didn't. I didn't stop you because you're black. I stopped you because you made a turn from the wrong lane. This is the kind of thing I dealt with. I only have one thing that I've done in my life in law enforcement involving a black person I regret. Should I say what it is? Bob said to me. Please. I mean, it's not nice. Please, I said. Okay, I'm not going to offend you. I'm not here to judge you, I told him. Okay. One night, I was working the road, and I stopped a Los Angeles Lakers center, tall black guy. Chamberlain, I said. Wilt Chamberlain? Wilt Chamberlain, Bob said, nodding. I stopped Wilt Chamberlain, and he's driving a car with Pennsylvania plates. And when I stopped him, he was speeding, and he was so big that he didn't sit where you normally sit. His seat was really pushed back, you know. I stopped him. I knew who he was. I can't tell you today if I wrote him a ticket or not, because it was so long ago. And this is the embarrassing part. When we got to the debriefing with the other highway patrolmen, and I'm sitting there and everybody tells war stories, I said, I stopped Wilt Chamberlain. And they said, so how did that go? I says, well, I don't know. He's just a typical nigger. And as it turns out, Joe Collins, that is not the name Bob told me, was sitting in the room, and I didn't know him. His back and my back were back to back. He's a black man, and all of a sudden the room went total silence. And I go, oh shit, I did something. I look around and oh, it was Joe. So I get up, turned around, and I stood up and apologized to Joe. Not being derogatory, it just came out, if you will. And I didn't mean anything by it, but that is one of the things I regret. To this day on the highway patrol, that's the only thing I've ever said that really hurt me. And I'm telling you now, 35 or 40 years later, that's what it was. But the N-word is not used today like it used to be. And that day, everybody said it. We're going back into the early 70s. When you said it, I asked, what do you think you meant by it? What I think I meant, he was just slow and lethargic to what I was selling. He was in a different world, and he didn't interact with my world. And he thought he was different than me, either better or worse or whatever. It wasn't a good interaction, if you will. And I've caught that dealing with other black people. Never, ever good. They almost had a different gait to them, different words to them. A different gait, I said? You mean like a different walk? Oh, a different walk. At this point, I'm guessing, Bob forgot whom he was talking to. They just ho-hummed around and walked differently. Not everybody, but I mean, they were just different. And that's just the way they are. And that's okay. And they talk and they have all their jibber jabber jive, God, I can't say it. Jibber jabber jive and stuff that they talk. And I go, whatever. I have to say first, this is me talking now, with absolute sincerity, and you can scream Uncle Tom at me all you want, that I admire Bob for telling me the story about Wilt Chamberlain. He did not have to do it, and as he surely knew, the story does not flatter him. What he did not know, I'm guessing, is the extent to which he contradicted himself in a very short time, making the light year trip from, I don't have anything against any color of skin, I don't care what color you are, to never ever good, jibber jabber jive. It would, of course, be, pick your adjective, pointless, dishonest, disingenuous, to claim that there are not cultural differences between many black Americans and many white Americans, and Bob, in his way, acknowledged that. But difference, once acknowledged, should be accepted without disparagement, and this is where my friend Bob fell short. Never ever good and jibber jabber jive, suggesting an attitude a couple of notches down from respect. How can one head hold both I don't care what color you are and jibber jabber jive? It helps enormously if the owner of said head is blind to the negativity of his own attitudes, which could possibly explain a great deal about Bob and a whole lot of other people, police officers, hiring managers, elementary school teachers. So I said, you said your first exposure to black people was in your line of work. So there were some people you worked with and some black people you encountered on the road. When you encountered black people on the road, did you, after a while, when you saw a black person that you stopped, do you feel like you developed a way of thinking about them before you interacted with them? I told you this earlier, and I'll stand with it, Bob said. I treated everybody the same. All right, so that's that. How am I doing for time? I have like one section that takes about 3.5 minutes to read. Is that okay? Okay, all right. So this is from chapter 5 of the book, which is kind of a summing up. So this is not the end of the book, but it's toward the end. All right. It is not uncommon for a person, especially a black person, to talk about injustices and to be asked in response, "What are you complaining about? You're doing fine." As if having a happy life disqualifies one from acknowledging the pain of others. Those responders are right about one thing, though, at least in my case, the part about doing fine. I've had a good life, in large part for the usual reasons. I've been married for a quarter century to a woman I love. I have 2 great children. I have had the good fortune to find 1 or 2 things I can do reasonably well enough to get immense pleasure out of pursuing them. And then there's this, the joy of being what I call plugged in. I don't use the term the way others do. I don't mean anything having to do with networking or using electronic devices. I refer instead to the excitement I feel over the prospect of learning ever more about the art forms I love. Something akin to faith is involved in the continued desire to learn, a faith that there is value in it, that it is all for something, even if the things learned prove to be their own value. I keep reading, keep looking at art, keep watching films, keep listening to jazz. Jazz involves a tireless exploration that nonetheless acknowledges the limitlessness of what can be explored. One day recently, I walked over the Brooklyn Bridge while listening on my headphones to Alfie's Theme by Sonny Rollins, an experience I recommend to everyone. Rollins' wonderful extended tenor sax solo seems to search, to bore a hole through the earth in its investigation of ideas, even as it suggests the possibility of more to investigate and the still greater possibility, nay, the certainty, that we will never know at all. It is a source of both anguish and comfort, though mostly comfort, that I will never get to the bottom of any of it, that I will simply explore as much as I can. And yet, every so often comes a voice whispering, "For what?" Having almost certainly passed the halfway point of my life, what is it that I am so studiously working toward? A body of knowledge and insight that will one day reach its glorious peak so that I can then die? The answer to this is no less true for being a cliche. It's the journey, not the destination, etc. Yes, The beauty of this chestnut is that it can apply to other areas of life. The drawback is that it is easier to think than to feel. To the question, what is the point of raising a family when your children simply grow up and leave? I can answer at least part of the point is the memories of raising them, the memories they share from the journey too, except that those memories make me miss them more, not less. The question about the point can be asked about marriage too. I sometimes feel as if I am in silent communion with my wife's parents, who died when she was so young, whom I never met and who never knew of my existence, as if they have entrusted her care to me, not because she can't take care of herself, but because we, all of us, need caring for, protecting. And yet there is no protection, not in the end. Sometimes when my wife and I hug each other tightly, I feel as if we are trying to hold off the inevitable. None of this is to say that the journey concept is not useful. Its value, I think, lies partly in its appreciation of the beauty of the parts as opposed to a concern for the validity of the whole. I may not see my children every day, but I can still smile when I think, for example, of one particular evening. Amy and I and our girls, then 10 and 6, stretched out on our beds at the windswept motel in Point Pleasant, New Jersey. As we watched the 2004 Olympic Games on television, after a day of hanging out at the beach and the pool, I thought to myself that I would take nothing in the world in exchange for where I was. And this appreciation of the part, the individual, as opposed to the whole, can apply as well to groups of people. I think I'll stop there. So. All right.
Is this working? Okay. Thanks so much, Cliff. I'll let you get a drink of water there before I dive in.
Thank you all for listening.
I was going to actually start with a question that was really about your introduction, but I actually think I'm going to dive right in because you gave the example of the interview with Bob. I'm going to dive right in. So first of all, I have to tell you that when I was reading your book, if you haven't read it, Cliff sets out how he was going to speak to what he hoped was going to be Trump voters, right? And put something on his Facebook page. Right. And for a second, my heart stopped, and I thought, what in the world are you thinking? Like, what? I mean, were you just going to have strangers respond to you, or it was all through friends? So that wasn't really clear.
So the people who ended up responding to me were friends, were people I actually knew in person, right?
Okay.
So, and as it happened, they both lived in California. So that was how I happened to go out to California and meet Bob, who you just heard from. Yeah.
I read it and I was thinking, you're just going to have total strangers say, sure, I'll talk to you, and you didn't know what you were walking into.
Yeah, well, when I went on Facebook, I put out the provision that they had to, I said, I want to talk to people who will not actually want to kill me. That was a qualification I put in there.
So why do you think that Bob actually told you the Wilt Chamberlain story? Because clearly it was something that he was not proud of. And you have a whole section, I think, in that chapter on magnanimity.
Oh, on magnanimity,
and,
yeah.
Yes, and I wondered what if you thought that was at all connected to the fact that he revealed this story to you. Was he confessing to you? I mean, it's really interesting that he gave you that.
Yeah, I mean, I got the sense talking to Bob that what you saw was what you got. You know, he had no, as far as I could tell, nothing hidden that was not also hidden from himself. You know, he was telling it like he thought he saw it. You know, so I think. But
why reveal it to you?
Well, I think his idea of himself is of a person who is a person of his time. So, you know, in the early 70s, when, you know, according to him, everybody used the N-word and it was common, and he has since learned that that's not a good thing to do, and now he views himself as having become, believe it or not, I would say enlightened. You know, that he should not he should not make judgments based on color. Of course, he does that every day. If you
jibber
listen,
jabber jive.
Jibber jabber jive. Yeah, right.
So.
He just doesn't understand that he doesn't know what that sounds like, and. I also would say, I mean, I'm not a professional journalist, and I went into this as a kind of a novice interviewer. But I do think if I have one valuable characteristic as an interviewer, it's that I can sort of make people tend to forget who I am, you know, because I don't. I don't threaten them in any way, right? So they so I think Bob relaxed, and he just started talking more than he might have if he'd been interviewed by Elders Cleaver, for example.
And you said that you write in that passage that you read, actually, that you thought that he may have forgotten he was talking to a black man, right?
Mm-hmm. I think that had a lot to do with it. Yeah.
Did you feel when you interviewed Bob, when you interviewed Jack, who also tells you some pretty interesting things, did you feel obligated to reveal stories about yourself to your interviewees, or was it very much?
They really didn't. I mean, I was prepared to talk about myself, but nobody asked really. And since I wasn't there to talk about myself, I was happy to have them just keep talking, and which they were happy to do.
They did.
Yeah.
They did. What about when people said things that were factually incorrect, right? So there's a passage where Jack, who comes after Bob in the book, says something about how Trump was that we know that Trump is President Trump is getting more respect around the world, right? Or there are other passages where the interviewees say things for which may not be factually incorrect, but where there's no evidence.
Right.
Did you feel that you needed to correct them? I mean, quote, under Obama, the economy did not did not improve, which is sort of ignoring that we were on the brink of economic depression there.
Right.
Did you? I mean, was there a conversation there where you felt like you could correct them, or?
Not really. I mean, my whole purpose was to get them to talk, and I felt like if I contradicted them too much, they would clam up, and I didn't want that, So I mean, it took an effort at moments to not say anything, especially when you made a comment like the one you just mentioned. Your impulse is to go, wait a minute, that's that's not true at all. But but I try to keep my poker face and just kind of let the conversation keep going, and because then that leads to the next thing, which and my ultimate aim in doing this was to figure out what their attitudes were, on the theory that their attitudes were representative of at least some of the other people out there. So I really wanted to not say anything that would that would prevent them from just kind of speaking their minds, as much as they were going to. Yeah.
And in the section on Jack, you write that Jack's wife did not share his views. Did you speak with his wife at all?
I didn't. I never met her. Never met her.
Okay.
Yeah.
She was not part of you.
She was all alone in the house. As far as I know, I mean, she may not exist for all I know. But he did claim to be married.
Because there were other things that weren't factual, so perhaps she didn't
maybe she wasn't
either.
factual either. I don't know.
I actually really enjoyed chapter 4, At Sea.
Okay.
And you talk about there is something, maybe you all know this, the National African American Gun Association, which I had no idea about, so that's pretty interesting. Yeah. But you talk about that's where you really start to talk about your relationship to America, and you're thinking about yourself as American. Mm-hmm. I know for me, my relationship to America and my conceptualization of myself as American changed radically with Barack Obama. And it wasn't even about his presidency. It was actually the 2004 Democratic National Convention speech. Yeah. And I really, at that point in my life, saw a different relationship to this country, a different relationship of myself to this country. Mm-hmm. And then it's shifted again quite a bit. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I wondered if you would talk a little bit about that and about your evolution of your idea of yourself as American.
Sure.
Especially now, as we're in 2020 and on the brink of another election.
Yeah. I'm in my 50s, and I came along. I grew up in the 70s, which were certainly more enlightened than some previous decades, but still had remnants of things. The story I tell a lot actually is everybody knows the Crayola crayons, right? The 64 pack of Crayola crayons. When I was a kid, there was a crayon called Flesh, right?
Oh yeah, I remember.
And it was the color of a white person's flesh, and this wouldn't happen today, of course. But I mean, at the time, so that's an example of a kind of subtle message that you would get when I was growing up. that, you were here, you were here, but, you were kind of an American, but yeah, not really, because if there was a crayon called flesh and it wasn't the color of your flesh, what did that mean, right? The makers of this thing didn't see you really. So how could you be an American? And I certainly didn't think about that consciously when I was, however old I was, 10 years old or whatever. But that kind of thing, it lodges in there somewhere. Also, there was, I used to hear a phrase a lot when I was a kid, all American good looks, Like, what does that mean? Who do you think they're talking about? It's not Denzel Washington, right? It's not Samuel Jackson who has all American good looks. So, those are just two examples of the many ways in which you get the unspoken message, if you're a person of color in America, who grew up when I did, that, you're in this other, you're in this other category. And it doesn't always even have to do, with poverty or police harassment or anything like that. It's just the way you're seen. And so, as I tried to hint at in the introduction, so, I grew up in an all-black environment, and then, I went away to college, to a predominantly white college, and so you sort of, work your way out into, the larger country, and then you start, and you're, grown by this point, and you start to ask yourself questions about, who, okay, I'm with these people who are kind of recognized, who everybody thinks of as an American, as being American, right? But am I? If I am, what is the basis of that? And in a place where there has historically been oppression of people who look like me, am I an American? Should I call myself an American? Is that an act of, would a self-respecting person do that? And so those were the questions I was wrestling with, and so when I discovered the writers who helped me kind of work through that, I felt consciously for the first time that I had, I thought, well, yeah, I am an American. I'm as American as anybody else who was born here, and that was a significant moment for me. So yeah.
What's interesting for me, we've talked a little bit about this before. We both have biracial children. My husband is black, and I grew up in rural America in a very segregated small town.
Wow.
And one of the things I always felt was, well, if you're white and you're black, at least you get to be in the fight. But for me and my family, talking about not even being American, you're just out here, right? That there's this whole fight going on. And when I met my husband, actually, we used to have this ongoing argument where I would say, okay, and he would say many of the same things that you said, but at least you get to be in the fight. I'm not even in the fight. So it's just an interesting way of thinking about it.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think, obviously I can't speak for all people of color, and I think not only every group, but every person has to kind of come at this themselves, and figure out their place in this crazy country. What
about for your children? And their views on the book and the whole journey that you kind of talk about.
Yeah, I mean, my kids read the book and they I think they liked it. My older daughter was a little embarrassed because I talked about an experience that I accidentally. Well, it involved her dating life, but she said, "Oh, great." Yes. So that's out there for everybody to read. But I think they responded positively to the book. So my kids are they're biracial. They don't. You would not look at my kids and think, oh, these young black women. It's like they don't look white, but they don't look exactly black either. So they get a lot of questions and that kind of thing. And I've watched them kind of work through the process of figuring out their identities too. And I talk to them as much as I can, and I've tried to give them a sense of their black heritage, but ultimately, I mean, I think the process of working through their identities is really their own, it's going to be their own journey. But I think they don't tell me everything, but I think the journey is going well as far as I can tell. So, yeah.
I'm going to just ask you actually two more things, but connected, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Yeah.
So. obviously there are a lot of different art forms that are really important to you. You're an essayist.
Yeah.
You talk a lot about jazz in your writing.
Yeah.
And I don't know if everybody knows this, but Cliff actually did the cover art and all the drawings inside. Those are yours as well.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about those different art forms and what places they hold for you, and then how you think about expressing yourself in these different ways.
Yeah, no, it's been great to, I had a ball doing the artwork for the book because, so when I was beginning, when I was about 7 or 8, I was a big comic book fan and fan of comic strips and Peanuts. So Charlie Brown was my first, kind of my first hero. And so I wanted to, up till I was about 18, I wanted to be a professional comic book artist. And so I used to do writing and drawing together. And then I had a sort of a couple of things happened. I had a sort of a moment of clarity. I can, draw better than the average person, but probably, the comic book world is fiercely competitive, and I started to realize that I didn't quite have the chops to make it in that world. But I also just got more and more interested in just writing by itself. And so, I took up writing and I kind of left the artwork behind. About 10 years ago, actually more than that now, about 12 years ago, I just got the itch to paint. And so I started, and I haven't stopped. And so I work in acrylics, and the cover of the book is an acrylic painting. And it's been nice to be doing both of those things again. And a goal I have actually is to. I had a drafting table when I was when I was a teenager. I don't have it anymore, but I want to get another one, and I want to try and do a graphic work of some kind, and sort of bring those two things together again. So looking forward to trying that. Yeah.
And in all the work that's in the book, I noticed that the figure, which I believe is you, your back is to the viewer.
Right.
Why
right.
is that?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. So the painting. So the artwork in the inside of the book was originally in color. I knew it was going to be in black and white, and I tried painting in black and white, which lasted about 5 minutes. I just couldn't do it. So I thought, okay, let me just do these in color, and they'll convert them to black and white, and that'll be fine. So there was one painting that I had done before that wasn't originally intended for the book, and it was it's at the start of chapter 1, and it shows a young boy, and his back is to the viewer, and he's looking out the window. Mm-hmm. So I decided to use that for the book, and I thought, well, it would be interesting to have all of the images be of the figure from the back. That way, you kind of see what he's seeing, okay. So that was my thought there. And I get to do things like have my hair thinning in the back, which
Well, you have the hat on. So
yeah, there's a bald spot
okay
in the
on the
book.
cover.
Yeah. True.
I think I'll open it up now to the audience. Yep.
I have not read the book yet, but I was wondering how and why did you pick the people you interviewed?
It was a lot of it was chance. So the two people I talked to in California, I talked to because friends of mine introduced me to them, and that seemed safe. A few years ago, I got a message to my website from a woman who was asking if I had served in the Korean War. And the reason she wanted to know was that her father had served in the Korean War, and he was trying to find a black man named Clifford Thompson, and he wondered if either I or my father might be that person. Obviously, I am not, and neither was my father, whose name was not Clifford. But I stayed in touch with him, and he turned out to be one of the people. He lives in Missouri, and he was one of the people. I conducted a phone interview, and he was a Trump supporter too. I talked to people and told them what I was doing, and they put me in contact with people. So my cousin's wife, who is involved in juvenile justice issues, knew about a social worker in the South Bronx who she thought would be a good person to talk to, because she's just in the trenches and working with families every day and sees things that I wouldn't see in the normal course of things. So I talked to her, and then I discovered, I don't remember how I did it, but I learned about the existence of a group called the National African American Gun Association. And my first thought was, I've got to learn. I've got to talk to this guy who founded this thing, because what a combination of things, right? I mean, as I say in the book, the term African American has been around. It's been around so long now that we don't even really hear it. But if you think about it, it's a really interesting term. You got African in there, and you've got American. And these two things, especially in 2020, these two things seem to be in an age when Trump has imposed a travel ban on Nigeria. This is kind of this is almost a radical thing to call oneself or to call one's group, and then you toss guns in there. Then it gets really interesting. So I thought, well, let me try and interview this guy, and so I did. And at first he wanted very much to talk about guns, which I was happy to do for a while. But then I steered the conversation around to other things, and he had some good things to say. So that's a very long answer to your question. Yeah, sure.
Bill, and then I'll go like this. Yeah. Bill? Yep.
Thanks so much. This is really terrific. And this kind of comes out of the blue, but you spoke of Stanley Crouch and James Baldwin
Yeah.
and Albert Murray.
Yeah.
I wonder, just out of the blue, what do you think of Spike Lee?
What do I think of Spike Lee? Well,
I found myself thinking about The Black Klansman, what a movie that kind of blew me away.
yeah. Well, we should have a conversation about that. That's not my favorite of his movies. I think I really like I like a lot of his movies, and I think he's obviously a very important figure. And I think it's almost impossible to overstate the effect that he's had on movies and the way movies or the way black characters in movies are perceived, and people who work in black people who work in movies. I mean, it's impossible not to respect what he has done, And there was a time, I mean, I remember in the 80s, like a Spike Lee movie was it was more than a movie, it was an event, And I would go to every one, and I don't know when I've missed a bunch at this point, but back in the days of Do the Right Thing and that era.
She's Gotta Have It.
She's Gotta Have It, yeah. She's Gotta Have It. It's like, I have never seen anything like this in my life.
That was a whole new thing.
It was a whole new thing.
It was a whole new thing.
I'll never forget. I saw that in a theater on Flatbush Avenue in Brooklyn, and then it got to the end, and I didn't know who Spike Lee was. And it got to the end, and they rolled the credits, and it showed Spike. Director Spike Lee. It's like, that's Spike Lee. This little guy is
that little
Spike
guy
Lee?
with the glasses. Yeah.
It was yeah. It's hard to overstate how much of a surprise his career was in the beginning. But I respect and admire him. So, yeah.
Melissa, and then I'll go up here.
Well, yeah. I'm interested in two things about your conversations, and I said this to Cliff, but I belong to a political organization that is working against Trump.
Yeah.
And they're teaching us to have conversations and go out. And so I did this a Sunday ago where I went to Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and knocked on people's doors and tried to have a conversation. And their whole shtick is, and I'm just curious what you think, is that it's not about issues, it's about connecting, it's about connecting emotionally. So I know you don't probably want to talk about like all Trump voters, but I'm just curious after these conversations, what your sense is what people were voting for. That's one question. And the other is, I've only done it once, so I have to go back in April.
Yeah.
But their idea, and they claim they have studies to show this, that the connection matters. That the fact that you have that connection with one person at their door, and hopefully you tell something personal and they tell something personal, actually has an effect about the way people think about politics, because politics are ultimately personal. So my second question is, do you can't know, but did you feel just having those conversations with these people just talking to you, is that going to have any kind of impact on their worldview, on the way they think about it?
Yeah, I doubt anything. I doubt that those conversations will have an impact on the people I talk to. However, I've gotten a few email messages from strangers who read my book, and that's, like 2 or 3 or something. But I'm hoping they're representative of more people who aren't writing me. But I heard from a guy in Texas, a white man in Texas who voted for Trump. He's got 2 daughters, and he said, a friend of mine gave me your book, and I just want you to know that I deeply regret what I did in voting for him, and I learned things from the book, and I'm trying to learn, and I'm trying to raise my daughters right, and I want them to respect me, and so that really moved me, and I think maybe I don't exactly preach. I don't know. I mean, I'm in the book. It's a process of just like trying to understand things. And so, to your first question, why did they vote the way they did? I think there is, as I end up saying in the book, there are several factors that I identify, and certainly just like outright virulent, unapologetic racism is certainly a factor was a factor in the last presidential election. But I think there are others, and I think there's a lot of ignorance out there. I think there's a lot of denial about conditions facing people of color. But I think the kind of sleeper factor, and probably the most important one, and the one that transcends issues of race or anything like that, is indifference. It's not that people are racist. It's not even that people want to elect a racist. It's they may not like the fact that the Ku Klux Klan endorsed Donald Trump, but if Trump represents what they think are their interests, then that's who they're going to vote for. In spite of everything else. And so I think that's a lot of what's happening. And I think somebody like Bob, who I quoted in the interview, he definitely. I mean, they see the conditions that a lot of people of color live in, but they don't. But as far as it's like tunnel vision. They see what they see, but they don't see what's going on around it, right? So they can't identify the causes of those things. So they locate the causes in the communities themselves. And to be fair, of course, everybody can do better, right? That includes people of color. Why should people of color be exempt from that? But the main forces affecting those communities are things that they don't see, are things that people like Bob don't see. So, so I don't know. I guess that's my answer to that. Yeah.
Question?
Yeah, I guess, take a guy like Bob, who for most of his life lived in an America that was actually significantly less politically divided than it is today. So I guess I'm curious, is that, given your experience and this experience, is that surprising to you that we're more divided today than we were in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s?
Yeah. In some ways, no, because anybody remember Walter Cronkite? Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Uncle Walter, right? He came on in the evening. He told you what was going on, and most people watched Uncle Walter, and he reported on the Vietnam War, and maybe you felt one way about the Vietnam War. Maybe somebody else felt a radically different way, but you both knew about it. You got the same information about it. And I think that's what's different today, Basically, I don't know, it's like I have this phone, it's around here somewhere, and it gives me news based on things I Google. So I'm getting my own news, And that's, we live in a time when people just get their own, they get news that's tailored to them, If you want to, and most people do, if you want to read or watch something that is going to just reaffirm what you want to think, that's what you do, right? And they never disappoint you. And so, one of the kind of what I think was a revealing moment in the book was I was talking to this guy I call Jack, and I have a figure. Eric Garner to me is a really iconic figure. He barely knew who Eric Garner was. There was a person who was really significant to him, whose name was Lois Lerner. Now, I didn't know who Lois Lerner was. It turns out she was an IRS figure who was accused of denying tax-exempt status to conservative groups, right? So she to him was a symbol of all that's wrong with America, right? But I didn't know who she was, and he didn't know who Eric Garner was, and that kind of says it all, Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that's what I think. Sorry, yeah.
Back there. Dave?
Okay.
Yeah.
I think my question's kind of the flip side of Melissa's question, which is,
Yeah.
did you change people by talking to them? I'm wondering how much talking to them might have changed you. And so let me start with an observation. I teach sociology of race in part, and the stuff I teach suggests that how you describe Bob as viewing himself as racially enlightened, and yet being able to dismiss an entire group with a stereotype.
Mm-hmm.
It's typical of about 90% of white America.
Okay.
Right? And so it doesn't have to be Trump supporters. As a matter of fact, a lot of those people voted for Obama and then voted for Clinton in the most recent election.
Yeah.
And so I guess the question is kind of twofold. Were you surprised to hear this out of the Trump supporters' mouths, or did it confirm more or less what you thought you were going to hear?
Yeah.
And has it changed now that you're back in Brooklyn and Sarah Lawrence,
Right.
how your interaction with white people go, or the way you're navigating the world?
Yeah. I was not surprised. And did it change the way I've seen it? I guess it didn't so much. It sort of the conclusions I reached allowed me a sort of tenuous or tentative peace of mind, I guess, about continuing to call myself an American and talk to me in November, because people are deeply flawed, and to an extent, you have to be what I call flawed just to kind of get through the day. I mean, you have to look out for your interests or what you feel are your own interests, and that's what people do when they vote the way they. It's not that they're not voting stupidly. I think they do, but they perceive their interest to be a certain thing, and they go along with that. And ultimately, I think a lot of it is not about prejudice so much as just as I said, indifference. And I understand. I mean, it's a valid point that you make that people. A lot of white people who voted for Obama and Clinton are certainly not immune to racism either. And I talk a bit about you mentioned the word magnanimity, mm-hmm. and the kind of danger of being in this kind of what you think of as a magnanimous position, that you can it's almost like you're reaching down to extend favor to people who are not like you. But if you imagine that you were magnanimous, then you can also take that away. So that I think what has to change is the notion that majority equals normality. That's what I would say.
All the way in the corner, yeah.
When you were talking to the Trump supporters, you said that sometimes they forgot who they were talking to.
Yeah.
Do you mean that as a black man or as like the position as an individual?
As a black man, yeah. I think I did not say anything that when I was talking to Bob, actually at one point I was asking him what he thought about statistics of shootings of black people, but that's as close as I came to sort of challenging their views, and so I was not. I very much made it clear that I was there to listen, and I wasn't going to challenge anything they thought. And so I wasn't there to try to persuade them of anything. And so I think the more relaxed they got, the more they forgot they were talking to a black person. So, yeah.
Right here.
What are your thoughts on the nature of living in a community that is not like Brooklyn or not like Sarah Lawrence, that does represent political ideals that are dangerous to you? What happens when you live in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and how do you go about conversations with people who are fine with endorsing ideals which you consider either that you disagree with or you consider dangerous to yourself?
That's a really good question, because to be honest with you, I avoid those situations. You know, I live in Brooklyn for a reason. You know, I don't know. I guess, I mean, personally, just speaking for me personally, I'm not a confrontational person. You know, so I tend to give I try to give people the benefit of the doubt until I can't anymore, until there is no doubt, you know. So I try not to assume anybody thinks a certain way, or that they are a certain way because of how they vote, or anything like that. I mean, I don't know what advice to give a person who lives in a community surrounded by people who have dangerous ideas. Yeah.
Can I follow up to that, because I rephrased. How do you, like, being that your experience with this this book is like having conversations with Trump supporters, how do you suggest, like, in a life that's just you're not writing down in a conversation, did you find that there were ways of having a conversation with people that wasn't an argument?
I guess, yeah, I mean, I guess the key is to remember that, I mean, odds are you're not going to change anybody's mind by yelling at them, you know. It just doesn't work. You know, they get defensive, you get more defensive, and it doesn't work. If you can change people's minds, it's through understanding of where they're coming from, I think. You know, it's a process of listening as well as talking, you know. That's what I would say. And in fact, probably more listening than talking, you know. Yeah.
So I haven't read the book, I apologize. You may have gotten to this.
That's right.
You talked about Bob and Jack and people forgetting. You became invisible as the interviewer, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Which is a great thing to do as an interviewer.
Yeah.
But have you heard from them since the book was finished?
No.
Or, I mean, did you send it to, you know, so what was that exchange when they're now seeing themselves in print?
Right.
Have you given permission for this?
I don't know that they have seen themselves in print, actually.
So you didn't?
Yeah, it's one of those things, it's like, I don't know.
Or the friends who recommend, right there, you've made them anonymous, but presumably the people who connected you to them recognize.
Yeah. I mean, I've talked to them. Yeah, they've read the book and everything.
So
Yeah.
I'm just curious what the sort of aftermath from people who maybe know, or whether that's provoked a continued conversation.
Not really. I mean, it's sort of like, yeah. I mean, I feel like as a point of honor, I need to send them these. I need to send Bob and Jack these books. I just haven't done it. It's kind of like. It's like paying estimated taxes. You know you got to do it. You just don't want to. You know? So I'm guilty there.
How
But
do you think they'll react? I mean, is the delay in sending it not just estimated tax, but
yeah. No, I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, I think Jack, like, you know, I had this theory of how people, like, you know, people who think similarly to Jack view the world in terms of this whole discussion of freedom in the book, right, and their ideas of freedom, and I ran it by Jack after the interview, and he said, yeah, I think that's about right, you know. So I sort of broke down like what different people's ideas of what being an American means and freedom and what that means. So I think I at least represented the best of his ideas, and I hope he would appreciate that when he reads the interviews. So.
You think they'll recognize themselves in the book? I mean,
I think so. Yeah.
I mean, do they ever recognize in the sense of?
Did I really say that kind of thing? Or?
Yeah, or did he really hear what I was trying to say? Right? You know, even though you were in the way that you did you talked about. you each had two different stories of Eric Garner and
Yeah.
the world didn't even cross.
Right, yeah.
So the ability to sort of hear and transcribe and represent.
Yeah.
The challenge.
Yeah, I don't,
There's a whole part where you express, when Bob is sort of beginning his story, you talk about how you kind of felt for him, right? You like felt a connection with him. There's real sympathy there from one human being to another, and then he kind of goes off. So
no, yeah, it's true. And to the point where, I was in his house because I know he voted for Trump.
Right.
And so we start this conversation, and he's telling me about his life, and he gets comfortable, and I get comfortable, and so I said, so who'd you vote for? And he said, Trump. I was like, what? And of course I knew he voted for Trump. But I was like, wait a second.
That's what you were looking for.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. You mean the man I've been talking to? It was an odd moment, because we were talking like you and I are talking now. Yeah, and it's like, if you told me at this moment that you voted for Trump, I'd be like, what? It was kind of the same kind of thing.
I had a very similar situation with a babysitter that I had once, who was a wonderful, wonderful person.
Yeah,
and then it really made me think, whoa, wait.
That can't be right.
It made me rethink all kinds of things. You replay conversations and
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Are there questions? Yeah.
Hey. That's all right.
Sounds amazing. I do have a question, kind of, because you talk a little bit about this kind of jazz as a metaphor for identity, and I was just wondering if you could kind of expand on that, and also how, I guess, your identity has evolved too. Like this day, you talked about kind of, I think, all the way up to like college, and how that's kind of, I guess, just evolved into today in light of, I guess, political as well as kind of social climate.
I'm sorry, how?
Your your identity, or your, I guess, kind of this whole theme of your relationship to America.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's been a process of first becoming aware that I did question whether or not I was an American. I mean, and that questioning was going on in a part of my brain in a part of my mind that I really hadn't even really paid attention to, and so it was a matter of recognizing that, and then saying to myself, wait a second, this is, no, you absolutely are, and the fact that you thought otherwise is a reflection of just a way that Americanness is often presented. Which does not reflect reality, So I guess my coming to identify as an American was a process of sort of unlearning a lot of things that I had received on an unconscious level my whole life, and seeing those messages, those unspoken messages, for what they were. So that's what I'd say there. And I had started listening to jazz, and it all sort of came together for me, and until it was blown apart by the 2016 election. But it's I still hang out in my little office, and I got jazz records going, and I'm writing comments on student papers, and it's still there. It's
Well, it's just sort of great timing for your book, because we're in an election year again. And Cliff's book is right back there on the table for anybody who wants to pick it up. I want to thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.